What if the most powerful crown in European history didn't fall because of war or invasion, but because of a single family's fatal mistake? From Visigothic kings and Islamic caliphates to imperial conquests and modern-day scandals, the Spanish monarchy has seen it all. But here's the real question. How does an institution that once ruled half the planet end up begging for its own survival? This isn't just a story of kings and queens. It's the story of a nation constantly rewriting its identity through power, politics, and war. And before you hear the answer, if you're new to Little Historical, hit subscribe and like this video. Because what you're about to learn will change how you see Spain forever. Let's begin. Long before Spain became a global empire, its soil was soaked in the blood of warlords and the whispers of exiled kings. The first crown on this land wasn't worn by a Spanish prince, but by a Germanic invader, a Visigothic chieftain who had once sacked Rome itself. These outsiders carved a kingdom from the ruins of Roman Iberia, crowning themselves in Toledo. But here lies the first dark secret of the Spanish monarchy. Their power rarely passed from father to son through peace. It passed through murder. Nobles poisoned, stabbed, and betrayed their own king so often that the throne became a death sentence. One king, Leo Vigiled, waged war against his own son, his own flesh, simply because the boy chose a different faith. That tension, that intimate betrayal, never left the royal bloodline. Then came the year 711. An army of Muslims and Berbers crossed the narrow strait under a commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad. The Visigothic king, Roderick, met them at the Battle of Guadalete. He never came home. Within a few short years, the entire Iberian Peninsula fell under Islamic rule. This was not a brutal erasure, it was a seductive transformation. The new rulers, the Umayyads, built cities like Córdoba and Granada into centers of art, science, and forbidden pleasures. While Christian kings shivered in northern mountains, the southern courts whispered with poetry, philosophy, and the scent of jasmine. Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived together in an uneasy but electric intimacy, trading goods, sharing beds, and hiding their true loyalties behind polite smiles. The monarchy, for a time, vanished. But the hunger for it never died. In the north, a small band of Christian warriors retreated to a cave in the mountains of Asturias. A nobleman named Pelayo led them. Legend says they won a tiny skirmish at Covadonga around 722 AD. That small, desperate victory became the seed of a dream, the Reconquista. For nearly 8 centuries, that dream would burn in the hearts of exiled kings, illegitimate sons, and ambitious knights who wanted more than prayer, they wanted power. And power, as the Visigoths learned, always demands a price paid in blood. But the crown was patient. It waited in the shadows of the mountains, watching the south grow rich and soft. And soon, it would strike. And soon, it would strike. But not with armies alone. The crown returned to Iberia wearing 2 faces, one a woman of iron will, the other a man of quiet calculation. Her name was Isabella of Castile. His, Ferdinand of Aragon. In 1469, they married not for love, but for a darker purpose, to forge a single kingdom from warring Christian factions. The marriage was arranged in secret, against the wishes of nobles who feared exactly what happened. 2 crowns sleeping in the same bed, plotting the same conquest. Isabella was no fragile princess. She rode into battle pregnant, negotiated with pirates, and once told a rebellious bishop that she would personally drag him to the scaffold. Ferdinand, meanwhile, played the long game, smiling at enemies while sharpening his dagger behind his back. Together, they turned their eyes south to Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, a jewel of palaces and fountains that had survived for 250 years while Christian kingdoms crumbled around it. The war lasted a decade. But the real battle wasn't fought on the battlefield. It was fought in the bedchambers of Granada's last king, Boabdil. Isabella and Ferdinand sent spies to seduce his advisors, bribed his cousins to betray him, and whispered promises of mercy they never intended to keep. When Boabdil finally surrendered on January 2, 1492, he wept as he handed over the keys to the Alhambra. His mother, watching from a distance, reportedly sneered, "Do not weep like a woman for what you could not defend like a man." That cruelty, that intimate humiliation, became the signature of the new Spanish monarchy. But victory was not enough. Isabella and Ferdinand needed purity. They believed God demanded a kingdom without outsiders. So in that same year of triumph, they signed the Alhambra Decree, ordering all Jews to convert or leave. Thousands of families, doctors, merchants, scholars, walked away from their homes, carrying only what they could hold. Their property was seized, their synagogues turned into churches. The crown grew richer and colder. And then, from the docks of Palos, a strange Italian navigator named Columbus convinced Isabella to fund a voyage west. He promised gold and souls for the church. She gave him 3 ships. Neither knew they had just planted the flag of a future empire that would stretch across an ocean. The crown had risen again. But it was already hungry for more. The crown had risen again. But it was already hungry for more. That hunger found its perfect vessel in a young man named Charles, grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand, heir to 4 dynasties, and by age 19, the most powerful monarch Europe had ever seen. He became Charles I of Spain and, soon after, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. His empire was so vast that his courtiers whispered a boast that was almost true: the sun never set on Spanish lands. But here is the secret those courtiers never spoke aloud. Charles did not rule from passion. He ruled from exhaustion. He was a pale, lantern-jawed man with a nervous twitch, raised in Flanders, speaking French as his first language. His Spanish subjects never fully trusted him. They called him the foreigner. And when he taxed them to fund his endless wars, they rose up in rebellion, not with swords, but with fire in the streets. Charles crushed the revolt, but the wound never healed. He spent his life fighting France, the Ottoman Empire, and the Protestant Reformation, a storm of faith that splintered Europe into blood-soaked fragments. Yet the more he conquered, the more he borrowed. Spain's silver from the Americas flowed through his fingers like water. By the time he abdicated in 1556, exhausted and gout-ridden, he retreated to a monastery where he reportedly spent his final days testing coffins for comfort. His son, Philip II, inherited not just the crown but the paranoia. Philip was a man who trusted no one, not his generals, not his priests, and certainly not his wives. He married 4 times, each union a cold transaction of politics and desperate hope for an heir. He ruled from a grim granite palace called El Escorial, where he reviewed reports of heresy while eating alone. Philip's greatest obsession was England, ruled by the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I. He wanted her throne, her lands, and her submission. In 1588, he launched the Spanish Armada, 130 ships, 30,000 men, the largest fleet the world had ever seen. But the English sent fire ships into the Armada's anchorage, and then a furious storm scattered the survivors. Half the fleet never returned. Philip received the news in his study, reportedly saying only, "I sent my ships to fight men, not God's weather." But the defeat was more than a naval disaster. It was the first crack in the invincible facade. And behind that crack, something rotten was already spreading through the royal bloodline. The Habsburgs had been marrying their cousins, their nieces, their closest relatives for generations. They believed purity of blood meant power. In truth, it was poisoning them. The next king would barely be human. The next king would barely be human. His name was Charles II, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, and his birth in 1661 was celebrated as a miracle. Not because he was strong, but because he survived at all. His father, Philip IV, had married his own niece. His mother was also his cousin. The blood of the Habsburgs had been folded back on itself so many times that the family tree had become a knot. Charles was born with a jaw so deformed he could barely chew his food. His tongue was too large for his mouth, causing him to drool and speak in grunts. He suffered from seizures, impotence, and a body that aged like rotten fruit. The Spanish court called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. They believed his frailty was the work of dark magic, of poison slipped into his wine by jealous nobles. The truth was far more intimate and far more damning. His own parents had poisoned his blood before he drew his first breath. For 35 years, Charles II sat on the throne of an empire that once ruled half the world. He did not rule. He was ruled by factions, whispering advisors, scheming wives, and foreign ambassadors who treated him like a puppet whose strings they could pull at will. Spain's economy collapsed. Its armies melted away. Its enemies, France, England, the Dutch, carved pieces from its European territories like vultures feasting on a dying animal. And yet, the greatest suspense of Charles's reign was not about war or money. It was about his bed. He married twice, but produced no heir. The court watched with desperate, morbid curiosity as each night passed without the sound of a crying infant. What happened in the royal bedchamber became a question of national survival. Some whispered that Charles was physically incapable. Others blamed his wives. But the truth was crueler. The inbreeding that kept the crown pure had sterilized it. As Charles wasted away in the gloom of the Alcazar palace, foreign kings sharpened their knives. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, had already positioned his grandson to claim the Spanish throne. The Austrian Habsburgs prepared their own candidate. The question was not whether the Spanish monarchy would fall, but who would catch it. On November 1, 1700, Charles II finally died, childless, broken, and barely 40 years old. With his last breath, he signed a will naming a French prince as his successor. But peace did not follow. The war that erupted would drown Europe in blood for 13 years. The Spanish Habsburgs were gone. But the crown did not disappear. It simply passed to a new family, one that promised to rebuild the throne from the ashes of inbreeding and decay. That promise, however, came with a price. The Bourbons had their own dark appetites.